show. We're on the Team 980, always live as well on the free Odyssey app, streaming live on YouTube at the Team 980, where if you're watching, you see the one and only Clinton Yates. What up?
What's going on, man? You can see my pencil tricks for those of you watching on YouTube. This is what I do. You know, like that deal. It's like back to school, so this is what we're on.
Support your local back to school drive. There are many. All right, so speaking of the kids, in not a very fun way, we're going to talk Strasburg here in a second, but this story that came out a week ago about Northwest Little League, and people that listen weekly and know that you come on with us every Friday, might remember 2 weeks ago you were so pumped and so proud of that group. That's where the Little League team you played on, they got so close to making it to Williamsport. And then we find out pretty quickly after that there's quite a bit of chaos behind the scenes, and chaos is even putting it lightly. For those that didn't see the story, what are the most important parts of it? And then we can get into some reaction.
So the Washington Post Metro section wrote a story about Northwest Little League, which for those of you who don't know is the boundaries are basically upper Northwest, in a lot of where a lot of those private school areas are. When I played there, I was boundaried in because of the school that I went to, and my dad happened to live in the neighborhood at the time, whereas I grew up sort of on the other side of town on Georgia Avenue for the most part. But, that's how it works. It wasn't sort of a controversial thing at the time. However, what is the case now with Northwest Little League is not just issues of boundary stuff, which is sort of basic operational Little League kind of shenanigans, for lack of a better term, but, and I'm being very personal here, and I don't want this to be a direct shot at anybody, but as it turns out, the president of Northwest Little League, a guy I've known my whole life, a guy who is now the head coach of the All-Star team, is effectively accused of running an operation that a lot of people feel is just not above board. And for those of you that have been watching Williamsport for the last week, seeing these kids and seeing them give their efforts and seeing their parents and seeing the tears and seeing the plays, you know how hard it is as a kid and as a family to get through this process at all. If bad actors are involved, it makes all of it kind of scummy for everyone. And I'm not going to say that my league is the only league that does this. Lord knows where youth baseball is as a whole. And that's the reason, Craig, that I mentioned it's in the Metro section and not the sports section. Because if it were the sports section of the Washington Post, they'd have to take a whole larger look at how travel ball and all this stuff has affected what is the volunteer, community-based effort that is Little League Baseball. Of course, it ends on the big stage in Williamsport, but as a result, that means that the big money players of travel ball have sort of gotten into the mix and poisoned the water. That's a separate discussion from what happened at Northwest Little League. All I know is that when I get a 46-page complaint report from a parent and a person involved in the league about all the stuff going on, I didn't even have the stones to go to Williamsport this year. I just couldn't face it. I was like, this is just not what I wanted to deal with. And the bottom line is, when it comes down to being about the kids, there's kind of one way to do it, and every other way kind of feels slimy. And this just felt a little bit slimy. I feel bad for all the parents involved. I feel bad for all the kids involved. And quite frankly, for those who are running the board at Northwest Little League, if they think that they're doing the right thing and this is just a bunch of rabble-rousers trying to screw it up for them, then I feel bad for them too. But I know what it looks like as an alum of that league and that all-star team. And the word, Gregory, is embarrassing.
Yeah, and you mentioned the 46-page report here, and it helps, / hurts, however you want to look at it. It's like, oh, this is an area where there's a lot of parents who are lawyers. Yes. And that's part of what's happening here is if I read it correctly and I'm remembering correctly, like some of the kids who feel like they got screwed, like their parents are pretty high-priced DC attorneys. And those are types of people that, if there's a complaint to be had, are pretty good at filing it. And so how much of this is kind of like, do you think like, these are legitimate complaints versus, parents who are a part of this Little League world where they think their kids are entitled to everything and, everybody can't have everything?
That's the biggest question I've gotten is, are you sure this is an issue? Are you sure this isn't this? Are you sure this isn't that? Well, look, I played in that league, and I know what it was like, and I remember how things went, and I know people that are involved in the league, and I'm not saying that on some, I don't even know, like some.
It's not braggadocious, like you're
right. No, I mean this is just this is the world that I live in, and what I mean by that is that like it doesn't take much to make a situation like that bad for everybody. This is not, you do not have to be Al Capone to run a little league that is, not exactly doing it the right way. And again, for that matter, a lot of leagues operate that way. These kind of politics are basic to what is, again, volunteer-based youth programs. Do I think a 46-page memo was a bit much? Of course. But if you've got the time and you've got the interest and you've got the actual facts, well, I mean, what are we doing here? You know what I'm saying? It shouldn't have to come to this either way in my regard. And that's why it was so disheartening, is that it'd been one thing if they had made Williamsport. Maybe this would have blown up in their faces at the time. I doubt it, because people probably would have just overlooked it because of the fact that they made that achievement. But at the same time, that's kind of what bothers me, is that you kind of feel like, man, was this a ball don't lie kind of situation? Although that's probably benefited other programs. Overall, I just look forward to the health of Northwest Little League, the league that taught me so much about who I am, to getting back to what it should be. The challenger circuit should be what it is in terms of giving opportunities for kids to play that don't have the same physical capabilities as other players. The softball program should be thriving the same way that it should be. And the boys and the girls who play Little League baseball should be allowed to thrive and grow as best they can, and not by the whims of 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 or 25 adults who seem to look at this all as some sort of power play for their lives.
Right. Yes. It is important to remember, as always, this is Little League. These are children, and we should act accordingly. Clinton Yates with us here on the Hoffman Show, Team 980, always live as well on the free Odyssey app. All right, to the big leagues and kind of the big story of the week here in D.C. on the baseball front, and that is the retirement pending of Stephen Strasburg. Press conference coming up September 9th. And I mean, when you heard the news yesterday, what was your initial reaction? Because, you can't be surprised intellectually, but it still hits you pretty hard, I'd imagine.
I'm glad he had the guts to do it, if I'm being very honest. This is a guy who, from the beginning, his delivery, the way he threw the baseball, I could get into inverted W's and arm slots and release points and all this. It was a point of scrutiny for nearly an entire generation in terms of how he threw. Was this going to be able to hold up? Look at the injuries. People used him as a case study as to how you were going to teach other people of that size to pitch the baseball and to be able to do what he did. He turned into a bit of a sacrificial lamb in terms of that. He was hurt a lot. It was difficult for him to get 15 or 20 starts in a row because of the veracity with which he threw. And I'm not saying velocity. I mean how hard he threw and what his body motion was and how that affected his particular kinetic chain. That said, he also embodied something at a franchise level that was very difficult to do. He was very publicly picked number 1 as a guy that was going to be the savior for a new franchise as a pitcher. Reminder, he got picked before Bryce Harper did and stayed longer than Bryce Harper did and actually won a title. People tend to forget. This wasn't just a talent thing with him. When it came to what he upheld on his shoulders from a star standpoint, I don't know that you could have picked anybody better than Stephen Strasburg to do it for the Washington Nationals. And the way that it ended, fine by me. We got what we wanted. And I just feel that for the fan base of DC, if you've got a problem with Strasburg, then you don't really understand what was happening when this team came to town.
Right. And I think if anybody has a problem with Strasburg now, it's like, oh, they gave him all that money after the World Series. And it's like, well, in an uncapped sport, who cares? It doesn't handicap you the same way, although the learners are handicapping themselves. That's a different conversation. And, of course, they also gave him an uninsured contract, which seemed unwise based off his injury history, and thus they will pay every cent of it. Yep. But to go to your point there at the end of you don't understand what it was like pre-Stras. When you think of Nationals pre-Strasburg and kind of what that environment was when he's drafted, paint the picture for people that might not remember what he was drafted into and why he is so vitally important and so revered by fans who have been fans for that long.
So let's take this back a couple of generations. I'll mention my dad because I mentioned this in any conversation about the Nationals. My dad was born in 1944. He's lived in D.C. since he was 10 years old, and the family migrated north from North Carolina, and he grew up, went to college, went to high school, did everything in D.C., and that's where I was raised. He saw 2 baseball teams leave, Craig. 2. The Texas Rangers and the Minnesota Twins exist because the Washington Senators left the district on 2 separate occasions. So by the time that the Nationals came back, even though it wasn't an expansion franchise, even though we had effectively picked up someone else's seconds in Montreal and the Expos. It was a new franchise, and the hope was real. They were playing at RFK, obviously where the football team played for many years, obviously where DC United played for many years, and there was so much sports history in there. They get the new ballpark. They pick this kid who comes from Tony Gwynn's program at San Diego State. Baseball royalty. He's the kind of pitcher that you look at, and speaking of Little League, you say, oh, well, he's clearly bigger and better than everybody else. Obviously, he's going to dominate. He was doing this at the college level in D1. And it was the kind of thing where you're like, okay, if somebody's getting paid to be a scout to pick this guy, well, then we could all be scouts. That's how good he was. And that's important to say because it meant that coming into the league meaning the minor leagues, his expectations were off the charts. But what it also meant for Nationals fans is that for people that were relatively new to what the baseball development world was, you got to see a star develop along the way. And it taught fans in DC a little bit of something about how this all truly works. You don't just pluck guys out of the draft like a John Wall and give them the key to the city and then they're rookie of the year and then they win the summer league or whatever and then they win a dunk contest and they're a superstar. It doesn't happen like that. Washington fans got to learn about the process via Stras. Bryce comes along, same sort of situation. By the time they both get there, Stras is the guy on the mound, Bryce is the guy on the field. But Stras was somebody that wasn't a big talker. All he wanted to do was play baseball, and he had stuff that was absolutely electric. There's a reason why the word Strasmus exists. It's because when he finally threw that first day, it was literally a moment in Major League Baseball. And I got to tell you, Craig, as somebody that was there in Houston, when he was on the mound, when it mattered for the Nationals, and it was he and his teammates who figured out, oh, guess what? They're cheating. Let's switch it up. They beat them in that moment on the road. That does not happen without Stephen Strasburg, and for that reason, he's one of one to me. He's the OG National, Craig.
Yeah. Oh, so I want to circle back to that in a moment, but I think that 2019 World Series is so interesting for him specifically because there was so much consternation about so much of his career, and none of it's really his fault. It starts with them saying, hey, man, we're shutting you down. So, they're going to the playoffs, and, we can imagine what sports talk radio was like.
The shutdown fueled sports radio for like three entire baseball seasons. It was nuts.
You don't have to imagine. You were doing it at the time. I was yapping away up in Syracuse, in college at the time. But you had the shutdown, and then you have injuries with relative frequency. I mean, I was looking up at his career stats yesterday. Dude's never won 20 games in a season, which is crazy considering his unquestioned greatness. But he literally never was able to put it together for long enough to have 20 wins in a season. Now, he had some seasons where the numbers were spectacular, and you're like, how did he not have 20 wins? But that's a separate story. But he never did. And then 2019, there's just vindication. After 2019, after what he did in that season, and specifically in that postseason, there was such a kind of crowning of like, oh, yes, this is why we made such a big deal out of this guy. Finally, it all makes sense. For anybody that had doubt, you cannot doubt him anymore. And I think that is a beautiful story in many ways.
It's not my money, Craig, but if there was ever a time in which, even as a fan of sport, not just as somebody that was a huge Nationals fan at the time, I would have said, give him whatever he wants. If they win this one, give him whatever he wants, even if he never plays another day, which was pretty much close to what happened. Because again, there's no world in which you can replace the value of what he already gave to the Washington Nationals fan base, learning and loving every part of the process to build a championship team. That squad and Rizzo, they maxed out that talent on a level that I'm not sure we're going to see for a long time in the major leagues. He said it. He said the line to our boy Jesse Doherty. Sometimes you're the buzzsaw. That was Stras who said that. He wrote a whole book off of that. That was the whole identity of that team in those playoffs, and he was right, and he was the leader of that. Again, there's no world in which I'm going to look at Stras as a wasted talent. A lot of that is through the lens of as a Nationals fan who was there, and so it's easy to say, well, it was worth it. But at the same time, for a guy who worked that hard, for a guy who had that much on his shoulders, reminder, Bryce left the team before they won that World Series, okay? So this is not just a 1-2 guy thing. One guy stayed. and one guy got the MVP. And that guy, to me, is a guy who, look, we can argue about statues outside of buildings and all that other kind of stuff, but I don't really care about that. All I know is that when I think of the 2019 Washington Nationals, the first person I think of is Stephen Strasburg.
Clinton Yates with us here on the Hoffman Show. So that gets us to the kind of key question we asked yesterday, or the fun question, sports radio-y question we asked yesterday. Who is the most important person to ever wear a Washington Nationals jersey? To me, there's actually kind of a clear-cut top 6, and that's Stras, Zimmerman, Jason Worth, Max Scherzer, Bryce Harper, Juan Soto. And that's the 6.
I think
you could probably
that
include some others, but those are the 6.
I do think, though, that there is the Scherzer, there is the Strasburg, Harper, Zimmerman tier, and then there's kind of everybody else. And that's not sort of a knock to everybody else, but again, I think it's hard for people to understand how important the impact of, again, having minor league players that you were paying attention to when your team was terrible. Most big league teams do not think about this with any regularity. Some do. I live out here in LA where the Dodgers farm system is a large topic of conversation because it's such a big deal for who they are. But that's because that's how their system works. They don't necessarily have 1 or 2 stars that are going to save the franchise. That is where the Rizzas, the Harpers, the Strasburgs were. People were looking at them like, please get here. We can't wait. I cannot imagine what that kind of pressure was like for those kind of players. And ultimately, I think that's why those guys are on different tiers. Some guys, the Jason Worths, the Max Scherzers, they came here to solidify something that was sort of already built, and they took it to the next level. That's not what happened with the previous 3 dudes. They were drafted by the team, came up through the system, landed in the big leagues, and 2 of them, as in 2 out of the 3, not Harper, won the daggone thing and were critical parts of it even after parts of their careers had broken down. There's sort of it's kind of the last boyish attraction I'll have to a team is that squad, because at this stage of my life, it's kind of not coming back in terms of who I am and what I've seen. But that team, I mean, I remember when all of them got to the squad, I can see their signing days in my mind's eye when they're wearing suits and ugly Nationals jerseys over top of ties. You know what I'm saying? 3 of those guys are in that book, and the others are not. And that's what makes the difference to me.
Yeah, Worth and Scherzer gave a validity, like a kind of a cosign to what they were building here in a way that's super important. And you almost forget, because Soto's career, you just get mad that they traded him, even if you understand. And by the way, that's going to be part of his legacy, but you just kind of get mad and you forget, like, oh, yeah, he was incredible in that postseason, that 2019 run as a child, basically. And his legacy is still going, because if they kickstart this next group off of the trade of him, it's like, oh, yeah, Juan Soto's legacy is pretty good. A World Series, and he set up the next 10 years of Nationals baseball.
Count your boy Rizzo in on that, okay? Because that's how you're supposed to do it. If you got to get rid of a guy who's a super fan favorite and you're going to make people wear it, you better make sure that the guys you get back are any good, because that reflects on you as much as it reflects on the player. These boys are having a little fun at the end of this season, Gregory. Dare I say, making some noise, which really means nothing, but, they're playing good, and that's how you want to end the season.
Third best record in the NL since the break. It's nuts.
What are you going to do? I mean, what are you going to do? That's
obviously
that's
the
what you want.
What are you going to do is go re-sign Soto when he's like, screw you, San Diego. This is not fun at all. That'd be amazing.
The return of the prodigal son. Can you imagine? He'd be like, I'm so sorry, guys. I don't know what I was thinking, leaving to go to Southern California with all this beautiful beach and beautiful sky and great weather.
Yeah.
Like I did.
Why would anyone want to go to San Diego?
No idea. That. But the long story short is that Strasburg retiring is ultimately a fitting ending for a guy that gave everything he had and got to the top of the mountain. And if you're the kind of person that doesn't understand what that means, well, then you probably were never a Nationals fan, and I'm okay with that. The dude is minted, and that will never change.
All right, last but not least, speaking of Southern California baseball stars with Clinton Yates here on the Hoffman Show. All right, Ohtani injures the elbow. He was going to be a $500 million player probably this offseason, at least, which is crazy. What is he now? He's still probably the best hitter in baseball, but you don't know if he could ever pitch again. And you want him to ever pitch again. Yeah. So what does that do to the conversation?
I'm not going to put this in the framework of an I told you so, but I will say that things that we've talked about is I was always concerned about how viable the two-position option was long term. You know, this was a question for me of his coming into the league. This was a question for me with this level of workload that he had, and not in a cynical way, but just in a, are you really going to pay a player to play two positions when the human body is not ever having proved, you've never proved that the human body can do that for this long, and he's already done it long enough. It is very sad to that extent, meaning we will probably never see him throw like that again. He's already had one Tommy John surgery, and if you get two TJs, the ability to come back and pitch on a major league level at all, never mind be dominant, is very difficult. But ultimately, and this is kind of a weird take, but like him not having the choice in his hands to make, I ultimately think saves a lot of people in this situation. He's not pitching anymore. He's playing baseball. He's hitting. He's in the field. He's doing something else. I think that if he's able to put that behind him and say, I gave this my best shot, I won a Cy Young, which he might this year, I think you can respect it. And he goes on and says, I'm just going to be the ball player that I can be at the plate and in the field. And he doesn't have to grapple with that with every single season that he takes on, with every other contract that he gets. The guy's still going to make bazillions of dollars, okay? He hits the ball too hard, he runs the bases too well, he's too smart, and people like him too much. But if the taxation on his body is taken away, he might even be even better at the plate and in the field than we imagine, because he doesn't have to worry about pitching every fifth day. I feel bad for him personally, but for the overall world of baseball, we got to see the best. It's not like this didn't happen. It very much happened this season, and if you watched it, you'll remember it and you'll appreciate it. This is very much a remember it because it happened, don't cry because it's gone situation for me.
Clint Yates, of course, ESPN.com, Around the Horn on your television. He's got pencil tricks. He writes with pencils, too. Actually, probably more with keyboards because, it's a digital age we're in now.
It's 2023.
And he's here with us every Friday. Thank you, sir.
The show's back next week. I'm back on. You can see me on TV with my gorgeous mug. Thank you, Gregory.
You're welcome. Watch him on television.
Hey, this is DA, and you're listening to The Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.